Great, thank you, Ken. Can everybody can hear me? Our presentations are actually quite symbiotic in the sense that I'm going to start sort of very broad and a little bit philosophical. And Katrin, being the fine lawyer that she is, will delve into more about how trade and development has been treated in agreements to date, and then how you execute on implementation of trade and development approaches on the ground in country. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's really always a privilege to speak in front of this crowd. And I really feel like this is such an important topic for everyone to be thinking about, no matter what area of trade policy you practice. Because, frankly, over the course of my negotiating career, I worked on a whole lot of different sectoral issues. I started off at Commerce, then I went to USTR, and I worked on a lot of different industry issues, and it really wasn't until I became the director for Central America and was working on the CAFTA that I think I was able to better appreciate the challenges that developing countries have, both negotiating agreements and implementing agreements, and frankly, just how important having the right trade negotiating partner is for developing countries. And I think in the process of doing that, we also came to realize that development is not an afterthought. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It rightly deserves consideration in the construction of trade strategies. And I do think there's probably a lot we're either not doing yet or not doing enough of in this regard, at least as a U.S. government. So I thought it would be important to reflect for a few minutes on the idea of Doha, the concept of Doha, and kind of what went wrong. And there are a number of things that went wrong, but let's look at some of the dynamics with the developing countries. As you know, the Doha Development Round was really launched around the promise of integrating developing countries into the global trading system. But I think the most important insight was probably the most difficult to act on in the course of the negotiations, and that was this. It's that developing countries themselves have to participate actively in the process of trade liberalization in order to reap the benefits, right? So if developed countries alone, as has been the case up until now, do the majority of the liberalizing, you will not reap nearly the benefits that you would if developing countries themselves liberalize. And the data points are there, and they have been for decades now, actually, and they very clearly show that developing nations that open themselves up to trade grow several times faster than those that don't. And that's because they attract private sector activity and they enable private sector activity to thrive. The World Bank has done a lot of studies on this, so the data points are very clear. And yet, much of the debate in the negotiations really centered on whether and to what degree developing countries themselves would liberalize and reduce their own trade barriers. And the mindset became, let's negotiate the flexibilities, let's negotiate the exemptions before we have a really clear picture of the obligations that we're going to undertake. So it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog. But countries were so fearful of the commitments they would have to undertake that they were trying to back into it, the exemptions and the flexibilities, not back into it, really put it up front. And so, things were getting a little bit stuck. And a couple of years into the negotiations, around 2004, I still think this is kind of an excellent analysis, even though it's more than a decade old. The World Bank at that time tried to quantify the potential benefits for developing countries of the Doha Round. And the key finding was, as I said, that the Doha Agreement, only one involving cuts and liberalization by developed countries, would overlook one of the most important sources of gains for developing countries. And why is this, right? The trend is very clear, and it's growing, that trade between developing countries, for developing countries, comprises at least 25% of their trade. But most of the time, on average, it's around 40%, and it's growing, right? So developing countries are trading with each other. And where do they face the most barriers? They face it with other developing countries, right? So 70% of the tariffs paid by developing countries are paid to each other. The average tariff by a developing country to imports from other developing countries is more than 3 times higher than the average imposed by high-income countries. That's a huge barrier for developing countries. So if they don't liberalize with one another, they're still going to be facing significant barriers to growing their economies through trade. The bank also projected potential gains in services. So, clearly in developed economies, services is a really high percentage of our economy, right? For us, it's probably, it's probably around 80% at this point, 70% a few years ago, it's growing. That's the case across developed countries. That percentage is not as high for developing countries, but it's growing. And even at that time, more than a decade ago, the bank projected that nearly $900 billion in annual income gains could accrue to developing countries from elimination of their own barriers and services. So those gains diminish or evaporate when developing countries fail to liberalize. I think the second major insight from the Doha round was there's a reason why developing countries organize themselves into negotiating blocks. There's sort of a lack of resources. There's a feeling that you're going to create some leverage for yourself by organizing into a group like the G20. But when you do that, and when you look at the composition of a group like the G20, you see not all developing countries are the same, right? For example, you have Brazil on the one hand, where some of their sectors, like in agriculture, they have agribusiness that is highly competitive in the global marketplace, dominant in certain sectors, right? And they are negotiating in the same block as smaller countries for whom agriculture is dominated by smallholder farmers. Their interests are not the same, but they're negotiating as a block. And that became problematic as well, particularly because when you think about the markets that Brazil, China, India offer, where the US and the EU and others are seeking significant market access, the expectation is much higher of them than it might be of the Zimbabwe. But if you're negotiating as a bloc, you're going to have some challenges there. I think the other insight that we gained, and again, this is not, I guess it is from the Doha process, but when you look at the trade facilitation agreement, I'm not sure if you've had someone come in and talk to you specifically about that agreement, but I think for our purposes today, what I want to point out is that there was a significant lesson learned there in terms of building trade capacity building into the agreement itself, right? So it's embedded in the structure of the agreement where countries can identify up front which commitments they're going to implement right away and which commitments they will require capacity building and assistance to implement. That's a departure from the way agreements have been negotiated in the past, and I think that's a really positive step in the right direction. And what it's indicative of is a recognition of the importance of demand-driven capacity building. And that's a strategy and an approach that we took when we negotiated CAFTA. Not because we were super smart and intentional about it, but I think we were just really pragmatic about it. As I mentioned, I was the director for Central America when we negotiated CAFTA. And quite organically, we took a whole-of-government approach, just because it made sense to do that, right? You have different expertise in different agencies. USDA has agriculture expertise, AID has different expertise, each agency has different sort of programs and pots of money. And so it made perfect sense to pool our resources and to talk about it very holistically. And importantly, the Central American countries themselves took the lead in developing their own national strategies. So in other words, they took a step back while we were negotiating and said, what do we think our needs are going to be, both to implement the agreement, but also to reap the benefits of the agreement. More importantly, to reap the benefits of the agreement, to position our producers and our companies to reap the benefits of the agreement. And so the capacity building plans that were created were closely aligned with the FTA commitments because they were developed at the same time. They were developed in parallel with one another. So we could identify those needs associated with both implementation and adjustment to the agreement and an orientation toward capturing the opportunities from the agreement. And they were developed in close consultations with local stakeholders. In country, in the Central American countries, they did a lot of outreach on this during the negotiations, not after the negotiations. And we engaged American companies as stakeholders. They were seeking to grow their business in Central America. They were more than happy to work with us to develop programming to help the Central American countries implement the agreement. But there's been a lot of discussion recently, I think some on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, about whether that wasn't sort of a high watermark in the U.S. approach to trade capacity building, because it was targeted and pragmatic. And trade agreements are only becoming more complex, covering a wider array of topics, so it's really critical that we organize ourselves to have a more deliberate strategy toward trade capacity building. The reality is trade policymaking is fairly centralized across governments and in our own government, but the provision of assistance is decentralized. So I think we have to create more fluid interaction in Washington among the agencies, but also to really leverage our resources in the field, because there's a huge amount of knowledge out in the field at our embassies across the agencies, and they're the ones with relationships with local stakeholders, and they're the ones who, frankly, are implementing on the ground. So there's probably a lot we can do to organize ourselves across the government to execute. And I think, ideally, there's a little bit of debate about this, but I think we shouldn't wait until negotiations are concluded to begin planning and executing trade capacity building plans, because in my view, it's not a carrot. It's our companies, for example, would like to take advantage of the agreement from day one, which means you have to begin investing in these programs and investing in capacity in your trading partners and deploying those resources before the agreement goes into effect, which effectively means maybe before you're done negotiating as well. So, you shouldn't hold it out as an incentive to achieve certain commitments or as a bargaining chip. I think trade capacity building is an investment that we make. I also think we should be looking beyond our FTA partners. So we tend to think about capacity building, I think, in the context of what we're currently negotiating, what we're formally negotiating, FTAs and TFA, Trade Facilitation Agreement, but we could probably do a lot more to think about, for example, seeding the frontier markets where we don't really have plans to negotiate a formal FTA, but trade capacity building is needed. And I think that approach would be fully supported by the private sector, frankly. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Katrin is that I think it's really worth looking at what I would call horizontal approaches to trade and development. When I was working at Abbott, worked at Abbott for Labs for 7 years, and we were focused on pharmaceuticals, of course, and medical technologies, but a big part of our business was nutrition. And I became very interested in issues of human nutrition and hunger and more broadly food security, and that's a big reason why I'm working on trade and development issues now. And working on the nexus between trade and food security. But when I started doing that, I started looking at those issues, what I could see was that discussions on the topic were happening in silos. You had people in the development community talking about agriculture productivity. You had people who were really expert in infrastructure or transportation talking about safe storage and warehousing and transport of food. You had another set of actors talking about things like global price spikes. So, you have people who have specialties in different areas that cut across this issue of food security. And yet, when you stand back and look at it from the perspective of what trade and investment tools we have, you have tools at every stage, in that spectrum, to assist with agriculture productivity and moving food to port, getting it across borders. And dealing with sort of price transparency on the global markets. You have trade investment tools across all of those, but we're not necessarily looking at it holistically. And I think Katrin is going to give you some examples of how you do that on the ground and how you execute that. But I'll just give you kind of a more theoretical example of it first. For example, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and you focus on boosting domestic agriculture productivity, you have to look at it holistically and say, yes, absolutely, we need to be investing in tools to help them boost productivity. But they're never going to be able to grow all the food. I shouldn't say never, but for the near term, they're not going to be able to grow all the food that they need, right? Population is growing faster. They will be importing food well into the future to meet the demand of their growing population. That is a reality. And so whether they buy food from within Africa or outside Africa, they're going to have to trade across national borders in order to meet the food gap. That makes good trade policies essential. And so, the contention is you can fight hunger and you can grow markets at the exact same time. If you take a step back and you look at it purely from a commercial perspective, the food and agriculture sector in sub-Saharan Africa has the potential to reach $1 trillion by 2030. That's a big market. It's a big market from a commercial perspective. And so there are good economic reasons to be focusing our trade policy there. It is not just out of pure development considerations. So I would argue we should have those commercial goals in mind if we're really going to troubleshoot and address the barriers that are going to generate opportunities for Americans, but also primarily for African growers and African middlemen and retailers. We need to be looking at the opportunities across the entire value chain. So what are different ways you can approach this? Well, you can start, as I said at the beginning, you can say, well, how do we provide access to the best available inputs? We can streamline technical regulations on critical inputs, right? Maybe the private meeting you say, okay, let's look at seeds and fertilizers, and how do we look at standards harmonization? That's a trade tool. How do we look at standards harmonization to facilitate access to those inputs? Then you say, well, how do we move food more cheaply and efficiently across borders? Certainly there's a lot of attention to port infrastructure, but you have to take that a little beyond that and say there are a lot of barriers that remain when you're moving food within countries. And when you're moving food across borders just within Africa, and that's not necessarily at a major port on the water. A huge percentage of food is spoils on the way to consumers. And so these are good investments that we can be making for good commercial reasons. So even when we're doing trade facilitation, we shouldn't just be focusing on the large ports, we should be focusing on internal borders as well. It's sometimes very hard to make this argument. I've had this difficulty when you talk to U.S. negotiators. Sometimes they're like, well, we're really focused on U.S. exports. Okay, but that isn't necessarily where the biggest commercial opportunity is for African exporters or for American exporters. Creating a large internal market in Africa is in the American interest. That helps Americans trying to sell their products there. So why not have a trade policy strategy that helps the sub-Saharan African countries really succeed in developing those regional markets? Improve the legal environment for responsible investment in African agriculture. We don't have very many bilateral investment treaties with African countries. We could be doing more to reduce the vulnerability to ad hoc government interventions that restrict African countries' abilities to affordably import food. Those are global disciplines, right? So addressing the problem of export restrictions or bans. So what I'm trying to say is that when you look at solving a problem like food insecurity, it requires stringing together a variety of approaches, multilateral approaches, TFA, for example, dealing with the export ban issue, standards approaches, which can be very, very specific, country-specific, regional-specific, leveraging all of them, trade capacity building, and leveraging all those tools to deal with something like a horizontal goal of achieving food security and improving food trade and taking advantage of these commercial opportunities. So we have to think very holistically about it. The developing countries already account for nearly half of U.S. exports, and they really represent the greatest opportunity for expansion of U.S. exports. They are growing faster than other markets, right? We're adding 2 billion new middle-class consumers in some of the largest emerging economies. So private companies have a major stake in promoting economic reforms and good governance and rule of law, and frankly, stable and healthy and prosperous communities in these growth markets. That's how people achieve greater income and are able to buy a product. The last thing I'll say is I really think we need to stop focusing overly on in terms of our own trade policy on having export of finished products be the goal. It's not really the goal. It's not the global reality, frankly. Most trade is in intermediate products, right? Supply chains extend globally. Production steps are carried out across multiple countries and increasingly in developing countries. So global businesses have a really vital stake in making sure that their suppliers are able to produce high quality, reliably. All of that provides impetus for investments in health and technology and standards and skills in communities in the developing world, and it really helps to promote a vibrant private sector in these countries. So we need to be promoting policies that create hospitable environments for these investments by private sector companies. So I personally just think trade policy is not about just trying to create trade relationships, and I don't think trade rules should be prescriptive, and they're not prescriptive about what to make and who should make it and where to make it and who's going to buy and sell, right? Trade rules create disciplines, and the goal of those disciplines is to create opportunities for individual choice and free commercial exchange. And so my orientation as a trade negotiator has always been, how do you clear the pathway for individuals to take advantage of these commercial opportunities to achieve individual economic freedom and success? And if we do that right, I think we unlock opportunities to address the development challenges. So with that, I will toss it to you.